In order to understand modern conservatism, one must be able to understand the American founding and its first principles. Like Levin says, conservatism is the antidote to tyranny precisely because its principles are the founding principles. Now, at the beginning of this presentation, I asked, what are conservatives inherently trying to conserve? The answer was our first principles, or the concept of American exceptionalism. Now, for the first 125 years or so of the American Republic, the federal government operated primarily within this limited government constitutional framework designed by our founders. Government knew its place in society and was essentially responsible for protecting our natural rights, providing a national currency and an army when necessary, and was responsible for foreign entreaties. Its primary syllogism was, the larger the government, the less freedom the individual had. With the dawn of the 20th century, though, a growing and vociferous, even nefarious movement was growing within the U.S. that would attempt to redefine the founders' vision for America. To understand modern conservatism, or post-World War II conservatism, it is important to trace the roots at which point in time the limited government trajectory meandered away from its founding roots. The reason a modern conservative movement even exists today is because a new philosophy of government expansion would attempt to recalibrate the Constitution and the role of government in society. This new philosophy would be called progressivism, and its followers would be called the progressives. Now, the early progressive movement era was initially from 1890 to 1920 and was personified by Woodrow Wilson and then FDR, but its effects are still felt today. This schism is important to understand, and it is the foundation for the two basic worldviews that we have existing today between political left and right, conservatives and progressives. For 125 years, it was understood that the federal government was to play a limited role in the lives of its citizens and perform just the basic functions transcribed in the Constitution. By the late 1800s and the early 1900s, though, society was undergoing rapid changes. These changes were due to many different things, primarily the Industrial Revolution taking place, rampant urbanization, transportation and communication improvements, and the development of the U.S. as a world power. From what primarily started as an academic and journalistic exercise, some began to believe that the tried and true constitutional first principles that we talked about before that had been built and nurtured America to the point of economic prosperity and social mobility were now no longer useful. In the eyes of these people, society was evolving, and therefore the Constitution needed to evolve as well, redefining the role of government and its relationship with the people. Progressivism is the idea that government needed to force societal, political, and economic change to meet the needs at hand. This change could only come about through an expansion of governmental power. While many were well-intentioned, as did the times call for certain reforms, their experimentation though led to the modern acceptance of a government largesse, and intentionally or not, resulted in trying to usurp the basic tenets of American constitutionalism. Now, according to the Heritage Foundation scholar Matthew Spaulding's book, We Still Hold These Truths, their ideas were based on three isms: relativism, positivism, and historicism. At the core of the progressives' worldview is relativism, not to be confused with Einstein's theory of relativity, but the idea that there was no such thing as fixed or natural truths. Basically, according to a progressive, everything was relative or subjective to one's own individual interpretation or worldview. This theory dramatically departed from the wisdom and knowledge that had been accumulated over 2,500 years of human history and Western civilization itself, derived from both reason and revelation. Basically, if there were no fixed truths, then that would imply that there are no natural truths, the thing that we talked about before. If this was the case, the entire premise of our government, The founding, ideas of natural law, natural rights, all men are created equal and that our rights come from the laws of nature or of nature's God, could no longer be accepted, implying that only government could create our rights. As you can probably already see, the fundamental problem with this is that a government that is powerful enough to create your rights is also powerful enough to take away your rights. Whereas our founding was based on a natural law where our rights come from nature. You can see the danger in this in that it could lead to abuse as the center of power of our government would shift from the individual to the government administrator. Now please understand, I'm not talking about government-secured civil rights enshrined in the Constitution, but the fundamental natural rights I discussed in the first part of this session. Now the second ism is the concept called positivism. Positivism is based on a theory posed by Auguste Comte that theological and metaphysical questions are essentially useless. Basically, capital T truth does not exist. Only through science alone can we learn truth. Carl Becker, who is an American historian, ascribed to positivism and once said that, quote, "To ask whether there are a natural rights philosophy in the Declaration of Independence is essentially a meaningless question. Notions of a natural moral order that can and should guide man and politics is akin essentially to mythology." Now, the problem with this is not that science can't help us understand some of the mysteries of the universe or even help make better public policies, but the premise that only through scientific methodology will we then be able to answer every policy question under the sun with the goal of perfecting society is flawed. This inevitably leads to policy devoid of value and rampant experimentation, which results in larger government at the sacrifice of your liberty and pocketbooks. Progressive educational reformer John Dewey once said of experimentalism that, quote, "Experimenting with and learning new ideas inevitably leads to change, moving toward ever-increasing improvement and the perfectibility of man and society. This movement is captured by the indefinite concept of progress." Again, this is not to say we shouldn't use science or analytics in crafting prudent public policy, but rather for the founders, progress was understood to be change in light of unchanging standards. Those standards, of course, were recognizing our natural rights, not just from reason, but through accumulated wisdom and revelation. Now the finalism, the third one, is historicism. Historicism is the concept that all ideas and meaning are relevant to their moment in time. Decisions must constantly be constructed and adapted to the times. Ideas of the past are, well, just that, of the past. In other words, what was good at the time of 1787 is no longer relevant to the modern day. Therefore, we must always reconstruct the Constitution to fit the needs of today. The progressives believe in the idea of a living constitution, a constitution that is based on empathy instead of law, personal subjective interpretations, and a judicial activism that usurps the other branches of government from their constitutional balance of power. Activist judges would legislate from the bench and take power away from the people's elected representatives or the people themselves. As you can probably imagine, you can see where this can lead to some problems. As mentioned earlier, the genius of Article 5 of the Constitution was the Amendment Clause, which allowed for prudent change to take place as necessary. The Constitution was to serve as a consistent rule book for administering government. This is why conservatives today promote the concept of judicial restraint or originalism, the idea that the original meaning or intent of the law provides consistency from one generation to the next. If it needed to be changed, it should be done through the legislative or amendment process, not by the whim of the courts. Courts are there to interpret the law, not make new law. Like a contract, the law sets expectations so everyone understands the same rules. If a constitution is changed from one generation to the next, What consistency could we possibly expect from that? Again, this is in no way or any means that the Constitution needs to remain a static document, and it's not, as we've amended it already 27 times. In conclusion, it's important to understand that the Progressive Era was the first major recalibration of the American government and its relationship with the people. The three isms, relativism, positivism, and historicism, were antithetical to the founders' vision of America and rejected over 2,500 years of human history and wisdom transcended from each of the great Western civilizations of ancient Jerusalem, Athens, Rome, and London, which would inevitably lead to the Enlightenment, where the American experiment of republicanism, consent of the governed, and rights based on natural law was affixed.